Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of The Narrative Alchemist. I'm your host, Dwayne Custer, and this week I have the pleasure and the honor of interviewing my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Ilana Rowe. Ilana is a published author and academic, as well as a curriculum designer in the fields of transpersonal psychology, creativity, teacher education, and earth based spirituality. She has also been a creative arts therapist and has led seminars and workshops on topics such as authenticity, spirituality, creative expression, connecting with the land, and imagination. She is currently semi retired from professional life as a university professor, most recently at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, also renamed to Sofia University most recently, and balances teaching with an active and creative life. Her most recent publication is a book called Sacred Stories, which we're going to discuss in a little more depth as we go throughout this interview. Well, welcome, Ilana, to the Narrative Alchemist. I'm so honored and I'm so grateful to have you here on the channel. You're one of my dearest friends and mentors and colleagues that I've had since 2012 when I attended Sofia, and you're also an amazing author, an artist, and academic. And I just wanted to thank you for spending the time today to go through a conversation and talking about storytelling and how storytelling can impact who we are and how it can change our lives and transform us. Welcome to the show.
Well, Dwayne, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you. So
Thank you. Yeah, I'm so happy to have you here. I have two interviews on the channel now that I recently did, and I feel like I have a pattern now with the type of people that I want to bring on and talk to that understand the idea of storytelling as transformation. And we're going to talk a little bit about your recent book, Sacred Stories, which I'll put a link to in the description to the Amazon link, as well as I'll put an image of the cover of the book here, and we can refer to that a little bit. But I wanted to start out with our conversation talking about how stories and storytelling, when the art or the act of sharing our stories with another person or a group of people can impact our lives. How's it impacted your life specifically?
when I got the list of questions that you might ask, I really thought about how story has played a role in my life for a really long time. Um, when I taught elementary ed and I would read them stories, I often read them stories, and they were nonfiction. They were fiction stories, but they were very healing for them as children. So it was a way that I could develop a relationship with the younger people in my life. When I taught, that was years ago, many years ago, I taught elementary school. And I've always seen story as a vehicle for transformation and for healing and young children. And I worked in the sand tray with young kids, and they would put their stories in there, and then we talk about their stories, and that was what was healing them. And that was a little later on. But I thought about stories, and thought about, actually, I had a very, very brief first marriage, very, very, very brief, and how I healed from that was to write a fairy tale about it. And so I took this difficult, painful situation and transformed it into a fairy tale that showed me the healing. And after that, I felt like I didn't even need to go to therapy after that, because the story, and it took me months to really write and rewrite, did the transformative work. And I think that was part of what brought me into some training with expressive arts therapy. So I think story, that kind of story, but also, like, I have a Thursday storytelling group, like based on the moth, where we tell our 5-minute stories. And that has been so great too, because it's not about healing there. It's about really getting to know one another, becoming a community, and caring about each other and laughing with each other. And this is all in my condo. So story to me is one of the ways that you really open the heart, get out of the head, open the heart, and bring in shared experience and shared community.
You just I have like 3 questions now that are not on the list.
That's
Um,
okay.
so
I
uh,
don't do very well with lists, so
you
yeah.
mentioned just for our audience, you mentioned sandboxing or sand play. Could you just explain what that is really quick for everybody?
Yeah, it's a arts therapy technique that can also be not there, but personal. It could be creative. It could be therapeutic, personal therapeutic, where you have a whole bunch of figures on a shelf, and then you intuitively choose the figures that are calling you. You put them in a box. It's in a rectangular shape, which causes a little tension, and it's filled with sand. And you put them in there and arrange them, and then you talk about what just happened in there. So the best thing I could do is show you if I could find a picture, I could show you some of the ways it works. But it basically, with young children especially, they don't always know what their true life story is, because it's
Mm.
it's part of, but they know what's working them, and they'll find the story that works for them, and they could, in the box. So in the box you may have um let's say a big gorilla is one I'm thinking of, and some very small people, let's say, they may be wanting to talk about how let's say the gorilla for them says, "Oh, this is how I am," or whatever. You can do it with adults too. "This is how I am," and then they just you ask them, like, tell me about these other figures here, and then they talk about that. It's really hard to explain without doing it.
Oh
Uh,
no, yeah, it's almost like you have to open yourself to your subconscious in a way. And
your imagination too,
your
yes.
imagination, yes, and creativity, and especially for children who really haven't established a narrative that's their own. Many of the narratives that children have are imposed upon them, whether that's through education or their parents, or society in general, where children for a while have to live in a world where the narrative is imposed on them
Well,
with reason.
let me give you one more example, though. Okay, so I had a young client who was having a very, very difficult time in life. And so she was working on inner strength, and she started building in the sand tray this mountain, and it became this bigger and bigger, every session a bigger and bigger mountain. It became bigger, and she would talk about the mountain, and that was really a symbol of her inner strength. Well, something went real foul in week 4 in the therapy, and at home, and she began to pound the mountain down. She had lost that, and it was a symbolic thing for me to see where she was in her journey of building up that resiliency at that moment, and then I could act accordingly. But I think the arts, whether it's sand play, or children's writing, them writing their own story, are really, really powerful for storytelling. So I remember years ago when I was teaching teacher ed, there was an article called "The Book About Daddy Dying," and this child wrote the book, and he kept writing the book, and he kept writing the book, and he kept writing the book until he was done. And then he was able to cope with the grief of his father. And it was just a book that touched my heart. But that's how he worked out the grief of the fact that his father had died, and how he could handle it.
I've
That
seen
story.
I've seen some therapists, counselors utilize Etch a Sketch as as an opportunity to bring out that creativity as well. And then, of course, there's finger painting and different kinds of clays that you can utilize. You mentioned something earlier which really, really fascinated me, and I'm like, I kind of had an aha moment for myself. It's like you mentioned turning your stories into fairy tales, and that just set my mind like, all these synapses are firing and neurons like, oh, I never thought about doing something like that. I was in Barnes and Noble yesterday and I was looking at the mythology section, all the different stories and fairy tales. And then you just mentioned that. I'm like, there was a connection there that I wasn't allowing to come through. It's like, oh, why not turn some of my own narrative, my own stories into fairy tales? How do you do that? What do you, what is
Well,
your motive there? I think is the question I'm asking.
this was my first marriage. I only did it once officially. And I think it was probably pulled from the book about Daddy dying. I don't know. I just knew I had to write a story. And it was part of the creative process. So the question you asked is, how do I decide to do that? I think I'm always inspired by creativity in some way. And I knew okay, so the story became the fictional version, the hopeful rewritten version of this difficult marriage and how I got healed. So it became more, uh, it was called The Prince and the Princess and the Wise Psychologist or something. But I wrote about, once upon a time, I started that way. That's the only way I knew how to start back then. Once upon a time, there was, a princess and all the sadness and whatever. And at the end, it was rewritten. The version of the story was rewritten. But I had an aha moment too, because as I was thinking about this in relation to your questions, I suddenly realized that the opening story in my book and why I decided to write Sacred Stories, a caregiver's journey through Alzheimer's, because at the moment there was there was a story that happened in the moment where I suddenly realized I had to write this book. But the story was my husband with the Alzheimer's was having a really hard time getting started. It took him 4 hours later. I was still trying to get him up and dressed. It was a really difficult thing. I was frustrated. I was angry. I was trying to work and I couldn't. And suddenly he I remember that sometimes when I'm trying to get him moving, when he's not sleeping, he was sleeping and couldn't get up. He wouldn't get up. He was sitting on the side of his bed. But suddenly I remember that sometimes I just reach my hand out to him and say, come. And he does. So I did that. I said, after 4 hours, it's a long time. I said, come, Hal, let me help you. And he stood up at that moment, came into my arms. But right before he did that, he says, oh, you are my fairy godmother. Now, I never put this together till today, that's again, the fairy tale. And at that moment, I decided that whole thing, one little second, cut through the Alzheimer's, cut through the horrible, difficult story of Alzheimer's. And I began to realize that there were moments that were really sacred, even as we go through Alzheimer's. And it started me off that way. I said, I have to write stories about the sacred experiences in Alzheimer's, not just the difficult times. There were so many things out there about, oh, this is how you do this is how you do this, 36-hour day. Not that, I mean, that's helped so many people. I didn't want to write that. I wanted to write about those moments when you could have a love affair with your partner, even though they maybe didn't know you, maybe they were really difficult that day. I wanted to write those stories. I didn't want to write the other thing. So yeah.
And fairy tales ties to mythology, which ties to Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey or The Heroine's Journey. And your whole book is
It's a
a
hero.
chronicle of your hero's journey through that experience.
I want to say something about fairy tales. They were the first psychology, and it's been so long I cannot give you details, but Bettelheim, years ago, I read a book where he talked about fairy tales helping young children with their trauma. So that might be a book to look at later. But so there is that archetype of fairy tales where he's turning into the prince, the princess, the ogre, all the archetypes. Yeah, and it is Joseph Campbell's. And I guess this was, I didn't know this book until after, had he died? He had died, or was he in the home? He had died, I think, when I wrote this book.
Mm.
And it came through the dreams.
Yeah,
So
which I want to talk about a little bit too here in a moment. But um, I I think in today's society, with all the technology, I think our younger generations have lost the art of fairy tales and storytelling and mythology because, you know, and even adults. I mean, we're all addicted to these mobile devices, and that's the world that we now that's our world, that's our reality through which we live our lives. So for me, it's even more imperative to kind of reintroduce the art of storytelling and mythology and fairy tales as part of the narrative that we all tell each other, which ties back to what you were mentioning about dialoguing and your your group that you have at home. You mentioned you have a 5-minute stories, and I look at I have a little thing called the 6 word memoir, which is a program that started a few years ago. And, you basically write a little snippet of a story or an event or a memory. And then you write a couple more, and then you meditate on those and come back to them and rewrite them or
right.
ask yourself, why did I write it that way? So I'm curious about the importance of that dialoguing with other people in those 5-minute stories and what that brings out. What does that do? How's their transformation there?
Well, that particular thing is based on the moth. Like I said, it has to be a real true story, and it can be no longer than 5 minutes. Not everybody sticks to that, but we try. It's
Yeah.
but that is very different than because we don't ask them about how to transform them, but they pick stories that have a lot of meaning for them.
Hmm.
Um, and what it really does is allow, because we have a lot of things that are about information, a lot of people who talk and do lectures on information or music of the 20th century, that kind of thing. But this makes us open our heart and hear the stories that we in life, and it gets us to be much, much closer to one another. I'm not part of this other group, but there is a writing prompt group that somebody was telling me, he's also in the storytelling, but the writing prompt, where because they've been together for so long, their stories for that moment have made them really, really close. And I think stories just bring you closer. um I remember years ago, I was in an authentic movement group, and we started sharing, and we were in chairs, like barely reaching the ground. And finally, somebody said, "Wait a minute." And they pointed somebody out, and the group said, "This person told it like a story. The rest of us told it like information." I think we ought to commit to telling our experience like a story, or sharing like a story. And we switch from, "Oh, I felt this way," to, "This is what happened. And this is, then I felt this way." It was a switch to a story theme as opposed to an intellectual. So it got you from here to here. And, that's some of the big teachings of some of the wisdom keepers is the biggest journey is getting from here to here. And, it becomes very different, when you go from the head than when you go from the heart.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I think the heart opening really comes into play when you are dialoguing with that other person or group of people. I remember uh, at the in-person seminars at Sofia University, many of them, we had activities that included expressive movement and dancing and creative arts, and often sitting down with a few people telling a story in a small group, and a lot of people just shedding tears and realizing that they were opening up about something that they hadn't opened up about in many, many years or ever to other people. And it's a very powerful movement and transition and transformation of your psychology and that information to a feeling or emotion or a sense of being closer to that oneness
Right.
that all of us are tapped into, whether we know it or not.
Yeah. I,
um,
I remember the stories. I can remember one. Do I have it here? I don't, but let's just say it was this, and where we all picked shells. Were you at that one where we all picked shells?
yes, I still have
Yeah.
mine.
I still find this isn't it, but it's over there. In other words, how does a shell speak about your life today? And that bypasses the brain of thinking about it. You just go, oh, look at that. It's got a bunch of worn out spaces in it,
I
And I
also
remember,
have a rock.
do you?
We
Yeah.
used stones or some kind of rocks, and I still have that too.
Yeah. But it really does cut, gets you out of the head into the heart. And I think that's what the story does for you. Whether it's a real story or a fictional story. Um, I thought about this today too, when I reflected on what we were going to do today. Years ago, when I taught children's literature to the teacher educators, I used to have this like words. It was from Madeleine L'Engle, the woman who wrote Wrinkle in Time. And I can't quote it because I was looking for it today. I couldn't find it exactly. But she said, stories are more truthful than nonfiction, something like that. But really, what it meant to me was when you change out the narrative, when you just don't tell the facts, which aren't facts anyway, but when you change out the narrative, it brings it into sort of like almost a cauldron and spices it up, and the metaphors and the archetypes come out, so the fiction allows you to get deeper into what you perceive as truth. It allows you to get deeper and maybe more universal, more archetypal, I
Yeah,
think.
that's why I call this channel the Narrative Alchemist,
Ah,
because there's alchemy that
right.
occurs, and the process that I use is called name it. So first of all, you name the situation or memory or experience by either writing about it, or, well, for me it's writing about it, but you could also do any kind of art or dance or movement, anything that will manifest that experience externally. And then you reframe it once you've encased that story in a bubble or a box. You can look at it from a third person point of view, and then you can begin to restructure it, reframe it, which is all a process of psychology. And then the way you do that is by empathizing with the characters, including
Exactly.
yourself, that are in that story. And then you open the heart chakra, moving into that dialogue with those characters and reshape that narrative. And all you're doing is reshaping your mind to say that that factual event happened, but my perspective on it today is vastly different now because I've been able to externalize it and reshape it. So,
And move away from it too.
and move away from it.
And so you
Exactly.
look at it, you're kind
Yes.
of here.
Yes. I love that you mentioned the whole part of the cauldron and your mixing.
Yeah, yeah. Here it is, little cauldron, you mix it in.
Well, it's nice to have like those symbols where you can actually understand. I, for my channel, for example, I could be either academic, or I could try to meet people in ways that they can relate to and empathize with. So symbols is the great way to do that.
Yeah.
And help them find the symbols and the metaphors in their lives, either through writing or storytelling or some other kind of art.
And I think because I've been thinking about the word archetypes lately, and I've been thinking about how, symbols, you're saying, oh, this symbolizes this. But when you get into archetypes, you embody the archetype. So you walk into the space where the archetype exists. And so it becomes not out there, but in here. And that's so this, excuse me, symbols and archetypes is quite powerful when you do stories, because fairy tales, that's all archetypal. You got the
Yeah.
dragon, you got, and people put meaning to it, and different cultures put different meaning. And I put meaning in my book, put meaning to certain things that other people don't, or they don't even believe in some of it, but I did. So
Yeah.
that's part of healing, I think. Yeah.
This interview or this video I'm adding as part of the series of videos I'm doing on the hero's journey.
Uh,
And it fits in really well because you're touching on Jungian psychology and archetypes and all of that. And one of the next videos that I'm going to be doing is all about the hero's journey archetypes. You know, the
Wow.
hero, the mentor, the enemy, quote unquote, and really how all of those characters or archetypes are within each one of us. We
Right.
all at some point in our lives exhibit those archetypes in some way. Um, and then by recognizing them and where we may be at, we can transform that story or event that we're going through and perceive it in new ways. One of my questions kind of ties to this was about, and you've already done this numerous times already, about sharing an example of a personal transformation that you experienced through storytelling. I know your book that you recently published is one way, but are there others that come to mind?
Well, there's one interesting, there's a form of therapy where if you, let's say you have a difficult person in your life, and let's just say that person in your life is, I'm just going to use the word brother or something. You can rewrite your story so it becomes, you reimagine it as your ideal brother and what that ideal brother would do to help you or to be with you and how that would look in relationships. And then you begin to shift into another narrative about your life. And I think that's one that I did a few years back around a certain situation. I think my whole life is kind of like that, though. I mean, from I mean, it's everything is sort of transformative, and everything is really story. I mean, as I was thinking, I said, well, this story here and this story here. And I look at my book and I'm going, there's many stories all over it. In fact, the whole book is written story, 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 one big long story and one whole
Yep.
long journey. And that wasn't intended. When when I woke up from a dream one day and it said, oh, time to write your book proposal. Okay. So I woke up and I wrote my book proposal, and it really was a to-do with spirituality in it. And then as I listened closer, it became a story. It became the story of the story of the journey. It didn't start because my academic mind knew the to-do.
Mm-hmm.
My heart knew the other, and then it began to grow, and I just began capturing the stories for each of the moments. It wasn't even written in order. I just would, did I tell you about what I did? It's in the book. I would wake up in the morning, 2 in the morning, every morning with a song in my head. It was like a popular song, and I would say, oh, that's the chapter I need to be working on. That's the story I need to tell today. So I wrote down many different snippets of stories and put them together.
Mm-hmm.
And so the dream gave me the stories, not in order, in different order, but I knew which story to write based on based on what the dream was that night before.
I think when you're mentioning that there is an unfolding and an enfolding of our lives that many people are not conscious of. That most people think on a linear
Mhm.
time scale, where what you're talking about is multidimensional, and there really isn't. I mean, the future and the past are contained in the moment right now, and that unfolding and infolding is a constant, eternal process,
Mhm.
psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. And when you grasp that, I look at it as the metaphor I use is the lotus,
Oh,
that it comes up out of the murk and the mud and blossoms into this beautiful, tangible flower, and then it infolds and it goes back to
right.
that murk and the mud and until it's reborn again. So that's the metaphor that I like to use in terms of how storytelling impacts me and affects me. um,
I like that.
Time is a very important factor there, the idea that the future and past are psychological, and in the moment is when they exist. They don't exist outside of the moment. And how we can change that time, uh, really is telling about our psychology and how we view ourselves and how we view our past and what we can do to build resilience for the future and things that we may experience.
And I think that's why like the ideal parent or the ideal brother, or whatever, work, because you read, because that story happened before the moment, but you're now in the moment creating the ideal and reclaiming that story, shifting it so that you come out seeing it different. So it's kind of playing with the past and the present, and that informs how you walk in the next present moment of your life. So yeah.
Yes, which is it's very telling, especially for one of the situations that we may find ourselves in is coworkers. A lot of people, they spend more time with their coworkers than they do their own families. So there may be a challenge there. And really thinking about how to create that ideal person, which may end up being fictional, but by doing that, you take the personal responsibility to say, what can I do to change me in
Right.
order to receive or experience this relationship in a new way, in a different way?
Exactly.
Um, because we can't change the other person, but we can change ourselves.
Right.
And I think that's a really great form of interpersonal relationship at work, especially when we deal with difficult people. um, you kind of touched on this already, but how has your identity, who you, your labels, and the understanding of those, that the application of labels to yourself, I'm an academic, I'm an author, I'm this or that, and if this ties into even your very own name, like when you think of your name and you write your name down and you meditate and reflect on that, the name itself is a projection of a psychological construct you have of yourself. So how has your identity changed or evolved in response to a new narrative, a new story that you tell yourself, whether that's internal or maybe an external narrative that's been imposed on you?
Well, I need to talk about name because as you know, I changed my name, and my name, my Ilana, means it means tree, little sapling tree in Hebrew, and nobody ever said, "Oh, Nancy, what a beautiful name," but everybody says, "Ilana, what a beautiful name," and I'm always reminded what a lovely bunch of sounds that live in me right now. I like that part. So my new stories, I can't even believe who I was years ago. I mean, I've changed so much and I'm still changing. I think I'm on a new adventure in a couple of weeks. It all feels like it's all moving forward. And I mean, there's stories, and then there's this kind of story, becoming part of the transpersonal world, for example. It didn't start the day I joined school. I had been reading mystics since I was 10. I had my first experience very young of at 5, actually, that I remember. And that living that and trying my best, not that I do it all the time, to grow in consciousness creates the framework by which your story keeps evolving and going down and being reviewed and all. So I think there's a big review process when you choose that. I think everybody, what they focus on shifts their story. If I'm focusing on money, that's one story that happens. You're focusing on consciousness. It's another story that happens. It's all, there are layers. When this one, it was something I had to do. It came into me. Do you want me to talk about this one right
Oh,
now?
I'd love to. Yeah. When you set out, you had an identity, and then how did that identity change after you finished?
Well, it was interesting because um, I knew at that moment I told you about that I had to write it, but I didn't know when. I was so busy caregiving. Um, I think having read it recently, over different times when I do things like this, I kind of re-look at it, to see. And what it did for me, this story and a story and a story and a story, as you call it, the heroine's journey, what it did for me, because my grief was pre-grief, anticipatory grief. I was grieving for 2 or 3 years before he died because of the circumstances were so, there was so much loss of not only his functioning, but also my own identity. Suddenly that shifted because my story, I was still doing the academics, but I was balancing it with caregiving. And thank God I could work from my house, you know. But um so I'm losing track of the story, but the story, as I reviewed it, I began to clarify. He was already gone. I began to clarify what that experience was for me. I began to look at it definitely in a transpersonal way. How can I help with that?
Mm-hmm.
I began to recognize the gifts that came through and the gifts I've given to others. The way, well, just looking at it, how it started, how it continued. I captured in this story moments that were very transpersonal, moments when you can only describe them as transpersonal, like especially right before he died, right the day before he died, this hawk appears and looks in my window. I'm talking to my rabbi, and she's helping me with him dying, and this hawk appears, and the next day, not even a day later, he's gone. And I'm now, as a transpersonal person, I have great symbolism for that. As a person who isn't, I may just say, oh well, there was just a hawk outside my window. Your stories kind of inform that too. Um,
So
but
for our audience, transpersonal I've described as going beyond identity, personal identity. Um, is
tapping
that
into,
how you would define it?
I also call it, it's so big, it's hard to say, tapping into things that are beyond self, and tapping into the things within. It's the inner self moving it out into the outer world, and they're all connected. That doesn't speak to it well, but the whole theory is that you develop yourself. You really look within deeply. You look at your own stories, your narratives, and you transform them like you're talking about. And then because you've done this, you're able to bring the aspects like that out into the outer world.
Mm.
And some of the transpersonal elements that I have here are just things that a lot of the world doesn't talk about, but I do, about, after he died, some of the things. I mean, people come to me all the time when I share some of my stories, I'd say, when my mother died, and when my father died, I could feel this, this is what happened. And and I kept saying, if everybody would talk about these stories, we'd all be a little bigger in our stories, in our conversations. And I'm okay with whatever people believe or don't believe, but I've had too many experiences, those kinds of stories, to not take them in my repertoire of all the stories in my life.
And I just published a paper on my father's death, and
Oh,
that it's all basically a whole narrative, but at the end I tied it back to the academics that the reason this story is powerful is because it transformed who I am personally,
oh,
uh,
that's
the
interesting.
psychological piece of it.
I mean, think about it in terms of like the narrative, the questions I asked. Did it do that for me? You know,
Well, you mentioned caregiver, and that's, from my perspective, that's an identity you had going into the experience with your husband, and then as you moved out of that, you're no longer caregiver upon his death. So
Well, I think,
that transformed your identity, the event.
well, it's very interesting because in my condo, we're all caregivers for each other. So it
Yeah.
doesn't quite, but my biggest healing when I was told by one of the 13 grandmothers, she says, she did blah, 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 you're healed. And I went, okay, whatever it is. And then somebody asked me to do something and I said, no. And I went, oh my gosh, that was the healing. And that's so that balance between being a very healthy caregiver and because of this, I write about the sacred contract you have between you and another person. You've chosen that. And being a little codependent in your caregiving, it's a real balance of story. You know, how can you be a caregiver? Well, how much caregiving is healthy for you? And then I had a mantra in here of when I made decisions, is this good for him? The decisions I would make, and is it also good for me? So that was part of the limits, the boundaries around caregiving was, if I'm making a choice and it's just going to kill me, maybe I need to find another choice around this one issue.
Yeah.
And if I'm making something that's for me, but not for him, then that's a whole other way of looking at it too. So those are some of the stories you tell yourself, I think, to help you. And I took a note on this before when I was thinking about this today. I think you tell yourself all sorts of stories to help you survive on a daily basis in a way. That was when I told myself, I created that mantra. You know, is this event good for him? Is it good for me? If I could say yes, then I can move forward. That was my story. That was my inner healing story and it was my compass that I could go by,
Hmm.
which I found interesting. And I think we tell ourselves things like they're right about this hospice. I volunteered for hospice many years ago, and the family felt like they wanted to protect. Their story was you got to protect the dying person from their death. So he never was told he was dying. This was somebody, a patient. I don't even remember his name, and that was their story. But that's how they survived
Yeah.
life. They told themselves that story. You got to protect. You can't let them know the difficult things in life. I have a different story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's necessarily what I would want. I would definitely, I think I would want to know, because just the idea of mortality, it's ironic because my last interview was with Carolyn Baker, and we talked about the grief process in connection with climate change and other climate chaos, the poly crisis that we're going through uh, socially and culturally around the planet. The grieving process is something that is very taboo in the United States, especially. And we tell the narrative that, we have to protect and defend, but when it comes down to actually diving into those emotions and experiences of grief, we we don't want anything to do with it. We set it aside because what it does is reflects our own mortality. And I think that's part of the hero's journey. You have to be able to go into that dark cave and be able to understand that you are mortal. Um, and, not to say, oh, I'm ready to die tomorrow. That's it. Life is here. We're supposed to, meaning comes from us putting meaning into life, the whole
Right.
idea of it. But when that time does come, a lot of people struggle with helping others move through that process of transformation. Um, and there could be so much gain from it if we were more open to the dialogue of grief and mortality and death. What does it mean to those who are still living, and how does it make our lives more valuable? um, so I have all of these questions here, but we're having a nice organic conversation, and I love that. And I'm looking through,
Yeah.
and I think especially in your book, Sacred Stories, one of the questions I had on here was, how does storytelling facilitate emotional healing and growth?
Um, Yeah, it's interesting. Like I said, my whole life has been stories. So it's always been that as a vehicle for healing. Um, how does it facilitate? I, I think again, it's the head and the heart, but um, by the time writing this story, I mean, it's hard for me to say. There's so many, like this picture is on the cover. This is my picture, and
Hmm.
it's on the cover because it tells the whole story. I was in
Hmm.
an art class, and suddenly the whole story, and I didn't realize I was doing it. I was just learning how to do sunsets, and I transformed it into, where our marriage being taken away from the sun into with the angels out there, but and the heron looking on, and you know,
I love the
it
heron.
it just told the whole story. And I think, sometimes it's just more subtle. You don't know what's happening. And it just, this, I think for this story, the whole story, it helped me clarify moment by moment what had happened. It made me get deeper. You talked about the enfolding. I forget the lotus, whatever coming, and the enfolding. When you rewrite and you write and you go, oh my gosh. And every time I talk, even now, I'm telling it again, I'm going, oh my God, I didn't realize the connection between this and this and this. The fairy tale. Till today, I didn't notice that, think about that fairy tale. But all those themes get layered. It's like and then it gets baked, and then it transforms and heals, if you're willing to do that work. And it's not so much hard work when your whole life is, it's hard work, but it's like when you think that way, it becomes part of the grist for the mill, as
Mm.
Ram Dass used to say. Um, but this book helped me chapter by chapter clarify. It also helped me to realize what I had just seen and how hard some of it was. There were two chapters here right before that I wrote about, when it was right before he got to the home, that I had to go out to the bay, rent a hotel for a couple of days and write them because I couldn't do it at home. And it's this one, Living Three Lives, where I put, I do it 10 o'clock, this happened, midnight, this happened. It's only a chapter like that, 6, this happened, because that was the tediousness of it. And it really made me realize what I had been through and how I simply could not even do it from my own home. I had
Mm.
to be away. I had to be rested. And that was a clarification. But the other clarification was, there's one chapter in here of this is the other one I had to write away, how hard it was, and how caregivers often die before their spouse because it's so physically difficult. And when you're in it, you don't realize it, but when you talk about it in a story, then you begin to clarify that, oh my gosh, this is what happened, and I could have died. I could have easily died because my body was in so much pain and was just breaking down. So,
Would you
no,
say that you moved that energy that may have, well, from one perspective, it could have been negative energy, that stress and the impact that was having on you physically and emotionally, spiritually, you moved that energy onto a canvas of whether it's art or writing or even moving your body as a canvas, and you are
you're moving.
manifesting
Yeah,
yourself on the page.
I like that because it is. It's a, it, it is an energy that you're sorting out and putting in different piles and reorganizing and all that. It's a way, and it's a way of release. When you do authentic movement and you tell your stories, and it's a way of you're transforming those stories, you're recognizing them, and then you're transforming them into another form. And you were talking before about from one creative to the next. That's Natalie Rogers talking about the creative connection and how you heal because you are going from one form to the next. And I like the way you said your body is one of the canvases that you put it. It's there. It is. It's, you listen to your body, and that's always very healing to know how your body speaks to you, and
Mm-hmm.
how you can transform what it's saying to you, because you're shifting it and shaping it and making choices about it, making a lot of choices about it. So there were other things that were very hard, that was transformative. I write about one chapter where I call it You're So Beautiful to Me, wives, friends, and other lovers. And it's and it's a really funny chapter, because it's really, where he's in the home and there are all these women who are arguing about him being the best man in the place, and I'm like going, oh my God, it's really and I had to come to qualms with, now it's different. He's got his life, I've got my life. That's a hard thing. But when I wrote about it, it was funny. I mean, if you look at some of the Alzheimer's, if you don't look at it as so serious, but see, these are the stories that happen. I saw with that story, the empathy that he still held in his heart. Even though he had Alzheimer's and was virtually nonverbal, he still had the empathy in his heart. He could touch somebody on the shoulder and show them empathy, even though he couldn't speak it. He could hold their hand and he could show them the care and empathy, and he got it back himself, And then there were other stories in that chapter where, and it helped me to accept that that's just part of it. It helped me to not make fun of it, but have fun of it, with it.
Provide a levity to lift it.
And to recognize that this hay is just part of that experience. And there were a lot of things in the story that were actually pretty funny, and to enjoy those parts that were not only sacred because they opened my heart, but they also were quite funny. Like the first week, the story of the first week when I was at this condo, and we're going from the car, we're going around the block, around the corner, up to our house, but suddenly I realized he wasn't there. And where is he? Where is he? And I realized, oh my God, he's gone into my neighbor's house. And I didn't even know my neighbor yet. We were just, so because he had some lemonade in his hand. And so I go in to get him out of his house, and he's got this lemonade in his hand. He had it in his hand when he walked in, but where was it? I couldn't find it. And I never could find it. So I went upstairs with him. Get out. We got to get out. Why are we doing this? What are we doing in this person's house? And so I went down when the neighbors got back and shared the story. He had a lemonade. He has Alzheimer's. He had a lemonade. We don't know where it is. Well, a few hours later, the neighbor comes up with the lemonade. He had put it in the freezer in his Alzheimer's mind. He thought it was our freezer. He put it in there, and we all just laughed about it. It was a funny story. But the story helped us to not get so serious about the Alzheimer's, that there are moments where you can just smile and accept that this is just the way it is. And that's okay. It's that acceptance of circumstances. It's just the way it is.
Well, I think you're being very humble by saying just accepting the circumstances. I think what is really powerful about what you're saying is the meaning-making process, and finding meaning even in the darkest, most negative experiences and events and circumstances we might find ourselves in. Frankel, and his book on man's meaning, that is
meaning. Yeah.
Yes, that is the most powerful book I think that anyone could read who wants to utilize the art of narrative writing or other kinds of creativity to really find meaning in events that they're experiencing or have experienced, traumatic or not. So while I think I think the meaning making process that you created was healthy for you and was the right thing to do, and it aligned with who you are spiritually and emotionally and psychologically, and it was the right thing to do. Um, Not
And
to laugh about it, that it's a funny experience, but the levity or the, I don't know, the, and this is odd to say, but almost finding the joy in it, the joy.
and the joy in it, if possible. Not everybody can go there. Not,
Yes.
not that they can't, but the experience may look more like anger than the
Yes.
ability to look at some of the sacred stories. And that's a lot of people's experience. But to be able to laugh as much as possible through it, through the
Mm.
stories. Yeah.
10 years ago, you were my coach and mentor as I was going through this process of writing about my own traumas. And, from an academic point of view, I was writing a paper that I wanted to publish. But the process was a year-long process of actually sitting down and what stories do I might want to tell? Am I comfortable with exposing myself to the world? And even beyond that, looking back on that process, the paper was published, but and so many people have been touched by that paper, and it's been cited by hundreds of people. I think even to this day, some people find it odd that I find gratitude for some of those traumatic experiences because it constructed who and what I am today. And had I not experienced those things, I wouldn't be that person today. And the idea is, by finding the meaning in those events, I transformed who I am and was able to meet the future today
Right.
with more resilience and more levity and joy in terms of how I experience life. So, and I,
So was there a point where you made a decision to tell the truth, to tell the whole truth in your story?
yes, that point came about when, as I was writing these stories, at first I was like, I'm going to be ashamed that people know these things. I'm really basically standing naked, psychologically as a person to everyone if I publish this. However, I began to realize that by telling those stories, there were thousands of other humans that experienced very similar things and could empathize with those things. So, which has turned out to be the case. But at the time, as I was writing the stories, I was like, how much is too much?
Right.
And what am I comfortable with? And either I finally realized about halfway through the process, either I go full steam ahead and share the stories because what do I have to lose? Or I don't do anything.
Right.
Because I think authenticity is one of those very important things. If you're dialoguing with others about your own personal narratives and stories, you have to be authentic. If you create some kind of fiction, there's no transformation that happens. You're writing a Harry Potter book about other people's experiences, not your own. The process of writing your own stories about your own life
Memoir. Yeah.
and memoir, yes, you have to be authentic to yourself
Right.
first and foremost, because what happens is, and I've mentioned this in a few other videos and in my own writings, if you elect not to go into that dark cave of yourself, you perpetuate the trauma, you perpetuate the abuse or the you know, you perpetuate for example, for me, it was homophobia
Right.
by experiencing childhood sexual abuse and putting that down deep into my consciousness and not bringing it to the surface where light could actually heal it. I was perpetuating the abuse through homophobia against others and myself. And when that aha moment came, I'm like, I'm still experiencing that trauma, even
Right.
though it's gone. It's long since been over. So through the process of writing those stories, through with your help and being able to see that, I was able to restructure those stories to serve me to come out of that self-traumatization and self-abuse and move into a state of forgiveness and gratitude and
Yeah.
joy, not the joy of the horrific experience happening, but the joy of the recognition that I was perpetuating that trauma today. So that transformed my whole psychology. And that's why I'm going through this PhD, because it's a transformative program. And I want to help, especially LGBTQ individuals, move through their trauma. You never know how your life story is going to impact those of others. And if you're vulnerable and authentic and allow that dialogue to happen, you can transform others just by them engaging with your own authenticity and vulnerability and courage. So
I totally agree. And I think that's kind of the proof of the pudding is when people have remarks or they say something that you have said, or like I'll hear people commenting on a line or something, and I had to make a choice of truthfulness. There was one little piece I didn't want to put in, and I put it in, and it was a smaller piece, but it was a piece I kind of just didn't want to, and my editor said, "Well, what about that?" I went, "Oh, okay." But there was another piece that didn't have much to do with me in the story, but I knew that this one of his relatives would would be hurt by it. So I just said, "No, that's not important." So I had to make choices along the way. Uh,
mhm.
and also the way the truth is told. And there was a horrific story in here on an airplane with his Alzheimer's, he wasn't able to hold himself, his bodily functions on a plane. And it was a horrible story. It was an embarrassing story. And I was at first looking at an editor, I guess it was, and she wanted me to move that story to the beginning. And I said, wait a minute, this is not Hollywood. This is not a movie where you're trying to suck people in. This is a story about my husband. We're not going to make that an opening scene for his life, because that's not what the opening scene is. I fired her because I felt a story, when you write it, something like that, has to hold a lot of respect for self, for other, for relationships, for love. You can't just, well, you could, but you don't want to write a story that's going to, the truth has to serve teaching others or helping others. It can't just be there for shock value.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
and
And
that's
I
that.
thought for a while, when I was writing some of my stories of that paper 10 years ago, I had to think about, am I writing for shock value, or am I writing a story? Because at the time, some of the actors were still alive.
Right.
And if we don't, the first and primary relationship any of us have is to ourselves. If
Right.
we're not authentic and truthful to ourselves, anything we write will have little impact,
Right.
because we haven't been transformed by it in the first place. How can
Right.
others be transformed by it other than through the novelty of it? That's what, like you said, Hollywood movies are for. That they're there for that shock and awe. When we're writing these heartfelt stories or these stories of transformation, and transpersonal experiences, we have to be truthful with ourselves and with those that we are impacting, the audience that ends up reading it.
And
Or
what's so interesting
yeah,
about that, sorry to interrupt,
no, go ahead.
but what's interesting about that is what might be truthful for me today may not
Yes.
in a year be the same perception of what happened or going forward, and neither for the reader. I can remember
Yes.
reading stories 3 or 4 times when I was a child, and I would get something very different each time because I had my experience of the story, my authorship, and the readership, they had changed. And so the meaning shifted, and which was what's exciting about reading anyway. And it's exciting about verbal story that sometimes you recognize something that you didn't recognize before.
Mm-hmm. So that's my dissertation. I want to demonstrate or illustrate the transformation that I went through when I first started writing some of these stories 10, 15 years ago, and how I view those stories today and illustrate that transformation process, and how writing those stories in the first place set me up to experience and engage with the future. Uh, and so it's like all of this is encased in one experience called my life. And,
Right.
there's chapters, yeah, that open and close, but they're all tied together and relate. And there's a system that's going on there. And that system all affects the other systems. So there's this, like I mentioned about the lotus, the infolding and unfolding of the truth of our lives, and how we illustrate that on paper or canvas is really important to recognize for ourselves. So while I say in my proposal that I want to write a narrative arc, which I will, it will be an arc of stories that demonstrate, a beginning, a climax, and a resolution. But how does my telling of a situation or story, how is it different from how I told it 10 years ago? And what changed, and how do I perceive it, and why did it change, and things like that, and really kind of discovering that, and bringing that new knowledge to the world. How do we change our ways of knowing and being through the art of writing, and reflection? So
And I
that's
think the
going to be a lot of work.
word reflection is so primary. You can tell your story, and then it's the reflective process that creates
Yes.
not just this writing of the story. But it also, for the reader, the same thing happens. As they
Yes.
read the story, they change and change and change and change.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like that, again, that reader writer, and what happens in the interchange between the two, the dynamic that makes the story so dynamic and so vital, is that it's a living thing that has a story of its own, so to speak.
I've had writers who were working on journal articles, as well as PhD candidates writing their dissertations, reach out to me, who were citing that paper from 10 years ago and the stories, and wanted to share with me the impact that it had on them, and gave them the courage to use, for example, autoethnography as their methodology, and also scholarly personal narrative, and being courageous enough. One lady mentioned to me that she wanted to write about, she experienced rape when she was younger, and she could not write about it until she read what I wrote about. And she, I wasn't giving her, the I wasn't giving her the, what's it called, liberty to go ahead and do it, but I was giving her the courage through my telling of the experiences I went through to share her process. Now, I'm curious. I know we're running out of time here. How, reflecting on your book and your stories, how does that impact what you're writing, or how your art today as you reflect on what you wrote?
Well, it's funny because this is complete for me, except for getting it out there, which is I don't have the mind for that, the way of doing that easily. It's more effort. But I feel like this is at one point I said, while it's my memoir, it's no longer my story. It's a universal story for others. And
Hmm.
I feel that way. Now, I can't say that there's not emotion. I read the poem he wrote me for our wedding day today as I was thinking about this, and I started crying. I couldn't believe it. I said, it's been so long and I'm still crying. It's the one where you touch me in my mind, in my heart, in my soul. I am you loving me, loving you. And he wrote that to me on our wedding. And there's a longer version at the beginning. And I still, when it just cracked into tears, couldn't stop crying. Because there's that love that still happens. And we shared this experience together. Um, and the question was, how does it influence me now as I write in the future? This one doesn't. I'll always tell the truth in the future. What I'm writing now is more of a swan song for my academic career. What I'm doing now is something I've wanted to do for a long time based on my eco-spirituality course. And I've done a lot of writing and a lot of forming and making a whole certificate program around connecting with natural world. So it's a very different type of writing. However, what I learned from this is I don't want to write it to do. I want to write it to be. And so my tone will be a to be. And so it's not the same story. It's not going to be grieving or anything like that, but it will be the sacred story of relating to the earth. Yeah.
So my audience is familiar. If not, I'll put a link to the video. But a few weeks ago, I did a video reading from one of your published papers on intentional kayaking and connecting with nature and the earth, and how that's transformative just in and of itself for so many people. And will your is your future writing looking at, is it poetry or prose? Do you know yet how you want to structure it?
Poetry, as a published author, every time you publish a poem, it costs you a ton of money. So it's not going to have the poetry, but it'll have other things that will be heartfelt like that. I'm going to keep that a surprise, but it will be, it won't be out for a year anyway,
Yeah.
probably. But I have the structure now. It's not ready, and it'll have image, and it'll be nice, and it'll be easy to take with you and just experience with on the land. So yeah.
Well, in a year, then we will have to have you back so that we can talk about your new work and the importance of nature, which is something I will be doing here later today, and going for a short walk and working in my community garden, and just being around the insects and the plants and other people of like mind is very healing, and it's just a wonderful experience to have. So is there anything that you would like to leave us with? I did have one question that kind of wrapped all of this up, and I'm just
Okay.
wondering if you thought about it. What advice would you give to individuals who wish to harness the transformative power of storytelling for personal growth and development?
Well, for me, anytime, I mean, part of storying is, okay, change journal writing to poetry, change it to creative nonfiction, change it. It's not just about journal writing that helps. That's grist for the mill. You can get a lot from there. But if you want to continue writing story, take what you have in your journal and make it into story. Reword it, reframe it, I think that would be, but keep joining things, do the moth, groups that tell stories. I'm doing improvisation right now. Oh my God.
Oh,
And there,
that sounds fun.
yes, and it pushes every edge that I ever had. Um, but it's really good for being spontaneous. And I also would say about story is cultivate your intuitive sense where you can see story in everything you do. What is the story of this glass of water? That's silly, but no, but there's story in everything. And it's in your dreams. I heard once, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it was a native person telling me when her kids would wake up in the morning, she would ask them, what is the story in your head from tonight? What story did you have last night when you were sleeping? It's reframed. She never called it dream. She just asked about the story. And so that does a couple of things. It gets you into your intuitive dreaming self and allows you to bring that forward. So I think stories are about really allowing yourself to open more fully than you do just talking, but it's about opening, connecting with the heart, moving from there to there more, kind of integrating the two and sharing that story. And the other thing that surprised me, it's not about the story just coming out, but it's also reflecting and transforming the story over and over and over again. That gives you a lot of meaning and richness in the story that you're telling.
I love that you pointed out the relationship to even inanimate objects, because that's a reflection of your relationship to yourself and others. Eckhart Tolle just published a video on his YouTube channel regarding the art of tea making, and went through and I love that he pointed out even your relationship to the cup, to the teapot, to the bag of tea, to the water, all of that relationship to those objects that create the tea, the process of making tea, was very powerful and impactful and transformative. By just giving a little bit of mental energy towards that and reflecting on it and being mindful of it, you change your whole perspective on even the chair that like I'm sitting in, or the pen that I have here, and the fabulous technology that we have to talk to each other virtually across
Exactly.
miles and miles of space.
People always, I think technology gets bad rap sometimes, but it's what is keeping us together right now. And
Yes. Well, I thank you so much for your time today, and I'm going to be publishing our conversation later. If there's any questions or comments that come up from our audience, I'll be sure to reach out to you, and if anyone has any questions. And I'm also going to put a link to Sacred Stories in the description below for anyone who's interested in purchasing the book. And Nancy, or see there, I did. Ilana, I'm so thankful and grateful for you joining me today. And I hope that you have a wonderful day too.
well, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. This has been wonderful for me to share with you your views on stories and allow me to reconsider and rethink about this whole experience that I got to do.
We had
So
our own aha moments together.
did have an aha moment.
You gave me the fairy tales to think about. Thank
All right,
you. Have a wonderful
thank
day.
you.